started. Blaire at Valkenburgh is actually known to many of us already. She's got her bachelor's at College, meaning to ask her more about this experience.
That's interesting.
I looked it up, and it seems to have been, even though it's named after the Revolutionary War party personage, or actually a signer of the Declaration of Intent. It seems to be founded in about 10 or 15 minutes before Blaire got her degree.
Yeah. No, 3 years. 3 years before.
So at some point I want to hear the story.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, it's also Canada.
This is not about me. Anyway, following that, she went to Johns Hopkins with a master's and a PhD and a postdoc, and then she came here.
That's
and
right.
she's been here advancing through the ranks for some time now, and she has now gotten to the august position is going up for distinguished or above scale or whatever you want to call it, where they no longer keep track of the numbers. And so, so it's on that occasion that Blaire is going to be regaling us about carnivores, evolution, and bones to behavior and ecology.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I'll tell you all about Stockton another time, but it was an interesting school. Yes, thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you guys. It's been a while, I guess, hasn't it? And yeah, my title I made purposely vague because I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about, but now I have a set of slides, so you'll see. So yes, bones to behavior to ecology. So this is basically what I do and what I have done ever since I started in my PhD. So using bones to infer behaviors such as feeding behavior, but then I was never satisfied with just stopping with the particular behavior. I was very interested in the ecology and the interactions amongst the species that I was studying. And so for this talk, I'm going to take you way back initially for a little while, and then I'm going to bring you right up to something I'm just a manuscript in preparation level. So we'll see. Okay, yes, so why carnivores? Yes, I have always studied large carnivores. Some of my students have worked on other sorts of things like vultures and walruses, but I have pretty much stayed in the large carnivore business. And the reason I like large carnivores from the point of view of someone who wants to study interactions is because they tend to be highly interactive. They're at a very high trophic level. They have prey that are difficult to capture and difficult to partition. You can't just focus on legs and let another predator focus on heads and things like that. So once you've caught one of these things, it behooves you to hold on to it, to defend it, and if you want, it also behooves you to steal from others if you're larger. So we have a lot of interactions among carnivores themselves that I thought in my initial dissertation work was largely focused around how these interactions and the competition within this guild of creatures, and we use the ecological term guild for a group of species that are using a similar resource, same resource in a similar way. So how this group of interacting, this guild, might have been molded by evolution over time, and how the competition within the guild would have determined the morphologies of the species that coexist in order to maximize, or at least maximize resource separation. So today, like I said, I'm going to start with sort of an overview of some of these big questions that I've looked at over the last several decades, and then I will move to presenting the results of a comparative analysis of tooth fracture in living gray wolves and its implications for our understanding of Pleistocene ecosystems. Okay, so here this all the way back from my dissertation. So what I did is I went and I made a lot of measurements, tried to quantify the morphology of carnivores, large carnivores, meaning something that's 7 kilograms and larger, so like jackal size and up. quantify their morphology, taking measurements that I felt would have functional significance. And this is a set of some of them that I took. And so, for example, the teeth are very useful for mammals because the shapes of the teeth tell you a lot, not only the body size of the animal, but it also tells you a lot about their diet. And with carnivores, there's a couple of very informative measures that you can make that involve these cheek teeth, the carnassials and the premolars and molars. And so, for example, what I did is I did this for communities of carnivores, both in space and time, so extant ones and extinct ones. And one of the things that came out of the diet analysis was this ability to classify carnivorous species into basically three different categories based on how much meat was in their diet. So you have hypocarnivores, like raccoons, that aren't eating all that much meat, less than 30%. You have mesocarnivores, coyotes and foxes, badgers, where they're about 50 to 70% meat. And then you have hypercarnivores that are eating almost entirely just meat, greater than 70% meat. And there's sort of a fourth little category off here of hypercarnivores that also routinely eat large bones, like hyenas, bone-cracking hypercarnivores. So using these kinds of categorizations, or using the morphology, and these would be species would be assigned according to quantitative measurements of their dentition to these categories, you can go back then in the fossil record and look at the associations amongst these types of animals through time. What you see here is a sort of, I'd make a multivariate morphospace using principal components analysis or discriminant analysis. And what you see here are the little bubbles or clusters that are for each of those three dietary groups plus the meat-bone category over here. So these are the meat eaters, and on this axis there's variables that assess bone crunching in this direction, meat specialization in this direction. On this axis it's omnivory and towards the back. So here you have all the cats basically, here you have the hyenas, here you have the mesocarnivores, most of the canids, and then back here would be the bears. And that's the present day configuration of 47 carnivores. And then what I did is I went back through time. Well, this is not going back 150 years ago in the case of Yellowstone National Park. And I said, who is there then? Who is there 5 million years ago? And who is there 34 million years ago? And you can see that a lot of these things remain through time. And the interesting thing is this is not determined phylogenetically. So when we're back here 34 million years ago, we're looking at completely extinct orders of carnivorous mammals that are taking the same roles in the past, and then this gets repeated through time. So from this kind of work, basically what I found was that one of the first things I found was the basic pattern of dental and dietary divergence within guilds of large carnivores was established at least 40 million years ago. And that sort of makes sense. So you have meat eaters, and you have meat bone types perhaps, and you have more omnivorous species of various grades. And that's because you really can't, the meat hasn't changed over time, right? And back 40 million years ago, meat had the same material properties, skin had the same material properties, presumably bone did. So there are not that many ways you can divvy up that resource or do anything with that resource, and it doesn't change over time, as opposed to ungulates, artiodactyls, let's say, who are evolving in a world that's becoming more and more open, more and more grassland, and their teeth and limbs, as we all know, responded to that change. You don't see that in carnivore dentition through time. Consequently, because of this, the composition of guilds of large carnivores in terms of dietary diversity is somewhat predictable. You always have a couple of cat-like things, you got a couple of dog-like things, you maybe have some hyena-like things and bear-like things. And third, and this kind of comes out of this, that the fossil record of carnivorous mammals is characterized by repeated evolutions of similar feeding morphologies over time. And what you're seeing here is like an extinct North American predator guild from 5 or so million years ago versus the Serengeti. And in this case, this is body size, and this is the floor is the same as the plot I showed you before with bone eating, meat specialization, and non-vertebrates over here. And you see this basic similarity with cat-like things and bone eaters there and bone eater back there. So it was instructive to see that there were some sorts of rules, basically, of carnivore guild construction. One of the types, getting back to that number 3, this iterative evolution that we see in carnivores, one of the ecomorphs, as we might say, that appears most often, commonly, over the last 40, 50 million years are hypercarnivores, that category all the way to the right. These are 4 different types of hypercarnivores. There are the wolf-like ones, there are the cat-like ones, which come in saber-tooth forms, and then so-called conical tooth, referring to the shape of the canine teeth. And then there are hyena-like ecomorphs. And these revolve repeatedly in different families. In canids, they've evolved both almost cat-like ones, certainly wolf-like ones, and certainly hyena-like ones over the history of the canidae. The interesting thing about these hypercarnivores is when you look at the fossil record of these different clades that have produced hypercarnivores, you see these sort of double wedge-like patterns where you see a rise in this red line is a hypercarnivorous lineage, becomes hypercarnivorous and then declines, and then it gets replaced, which we don't get to see the full extent of this, by a subsequent one. In this case, this is hyenas being replaced by dogs in the old world. Down here we have the canids becoming very diverse and hypercarnivorous and then declining and then apparently replaced in some way by some cat-like carnivores. So this rising phase of the history is always associated, or seems to be associated, with increases in body size and specialization, dietary specialization for hypercarnivory. And this was kind of interesting, and I kind of wanted to study whether this is really happening. Do we really see this body size increase and what's going on? And so I joined up with some other people, but I'll get to that. I forgot this slide was coming. To look at it in the fossil record, specifically in the family Canidae. But before we get to that, you might be saying, well, why do you think these things are involving larger size? There's a lot of reasons to get bigger that are good reasons. The good reasons for getting bigger is there are fewer predators that can take you. The larger you are, you're sort of size escaping in that way. You yourself can kill a wider range of prey, so your resource base opens up. You have improved thermal efficiency because of surface to volume relationships, and you have an advantage in interference competition. That is the competition battles over carcasses, for example, a mano type competition. Then why become hypercarnivorous? Well, the reasons why it seems to be attractive is there's a very high energy content of meat. It's very easy to digest. Carnivores tend to have higher basal metabolic rates, faster growth rates, and higher fecundity. So these are all good reasons that are maybe driving that evolution of hypercarnivory over and over again. After one group goes extinct, another group evolves in that direction. But there are certain things that make it a fatal attraction, because you could see how it declined afterwards. And there are costs to getting this large. There are costs. And one of the costs comes because of this, the apparent 21 kilogram rule of foraging energetics that Chris Carbone and colleagues published on in 1999. Based on looking at extant carnivora only, what they found that as carnivores get larger, they become hypercarnivorous. And as they become hypercarnivorous, they have to take prey as large or larger than themselves, which is a risky business. Okay, because wolves cannot survive on rodents and rabbits. The energy expended in catching them exceeds the energy gained. There are other costs because it's a very dangerous prey, and also a number of other costs as well. So, nevertheless, this does happen over and over again, despite the costs. And so I wanted to look to see in the fossil record if we could document in more detail this rise and fall in a particular set of clades. And fortunately, we have a wonderful fossil record in North America of dogs, of Canidae. And what you see here is a plot of 40 million years ago to 5 million years ago, and 2 different extinct subfamilies, the numbers of species, their diversification through time, and then decline of the Hesperocyanines, followed by the rise of the Borophagines and a subsequent decline. And this was work I did with Xiao Ming at the LA County Museum and John Dameth at UC Santa Barbara. And we wanted to document whether there was an increase in body size coincident with a change in diet. And what we found was, in both subfamilies, and here you're only seeing the Borophaginae, body size increased over time very nicely. There's time versus body size. And at the same time, and concurrent with body size, diet, as estimated from my dental measurements, it became shifted towards hypercarnivory, which is what is on this axis here. So this was kind of beautiful. So species got bigger over time. They became more hypercarnivorous as they got bigger. And then we seem to find, although we didn't have very as strong data as I would have liked, that large hypercarnivorous species were more vulnerable to extinction. Well, we see that they go down, but we thought that the reason for this was species duration. But just to move away from the plots for a minute and show you what it looks like in the fossil record, because it's kind of nice to see the actual fossils themselves. This is from a lineage of borophagine dogs, starting down here with something that's relatively coyote-like, with lots of teeth, as you can see, and a long jaw and not too deep, and progressively becoming more and more hypercarnivorous until you're quite specialized here. And one of the important things to note here is there's been a loss of features, right? There's been a loss of teeth to go to this extreme specialization. Interestingly, in both subfamilies, as soon as the first large hypercarnivores appear, then the decline begins. So this was it was easy to explain with the advantages of large size and the advantages of being a hypercarnivore, why this rise would fall. But it's always been a problem trying to figure out why this happens. And in our initial paper, as I said, what we tested for was we thought we saw shortened species durations. After this point in time, these species that persisted did not last as long and apparently did not speciate during this time, and so gradually they dwindled away. But from this pattern, we hypothesized, because we saw this happen over and over again, and there are other carnivorous groups where this also happens, that there's something we labeled the large carnivore macroevolutionary ratchet. So, and the idea was that pervasive selection for a large body size would lead to the evolution of hypercarnivory, or a diet of large prey. And this, in turn, when they do this, that requires morphological specializations for killing large prey, such as becoming large, such as those loss of those teeth, the shortening of the snout to make a stronger bite. And it results, therefore, because they moved up in the trophic level and body mass, it results in lower population densities, and consequently that might proceed to an increased vulnerability for extinction. So it was an interesting example of where you might have selection at the individual level to get larger and do all these things, but at the clade level, this is ultimately going to result in your demise. Since this work, I have had graduate students such as Myrene, who recently got her PhD last year, has explored this more fully and included all the canids. I only did those two subfamilies. She added the K9A, and she added a lot more data on species durations, et cetera, et cetera. And she found that, yes, she confirmed what we had found, that dietary specialization was basically linked to reduced species duration. So as you became more specialized, you tended not to survive as long in the fossil record. But the interesting thing was that she found it wasn't only the big hypercarnivores, it was the other extreme, the small hypocarnivores. So canids in the Miocene, and back here 20 million years ago, produced a great diversity of types. One looks like this, sort of like a raccoon, has a very raccoon-like dentition, and this thing also and its kin had relatively short species duration. So this reinforces this idea that specialization perhaps is not a great long-term strategy for a clade. The other thing that we are working on currently, wherever Mark is, my graduate student Mark, is that problem of what actually is happening during that decline. Is it simply shortened species durations? What are the drivers of that decline? Or is it a lack of speciation? Or is it a lack of, or a more frequent extinction, an increase in extinction rate? So it could be all of those, or one of those could be more dominant, and Mark is exploring this in his dissertation using hyenas and also a lot of simulation models, working with Mike Alfaro to see if we can tease apart what's going on. Okay, so that's mostly the old stuff that I'm going to tell you to give you sort of the perspective on what I've done. And these are a number of other things that we do in the lab, so I wanted to mention those. So those of you that were at the faculty retreat, I gave a lightning talk about this aspect. I've talked about this in the past, the anatomy of olfaction and respiration. I worked with Chris Carbone on an interesting study on sociality and Smilodon, making parallels with playback experiments in Africa for carnivores. This is Caitlin Brown, my graduate student sitting out there, and Myrene Belisi and I and Chris Shaw worked on an interesting study of skeletal trauma in Rancho La Brea saber-toothed cats and dire wolves, and Caitlin came up with this great heat map showing patterns of injury that differ between the two, that reflects their different ways of methods of predation. And then this is more my corner, the impact of large predators on Pleistocene and extant ecosystems. And this is what now the next section of my talk is going to relate to this. Yes, so now we're going to shift to this unless anybody has a question. We'll be like active learning here. Anyone want to say anything? I don't have a clicker question, so yes. Yeah, sure.
So for that first part, what you're showing is it's actually like niche conservatism, right? You have
Yes. Right.
That is conserved regardless of what the tax are.
Right.
And then you have a diversification within that niche.
Yes.
Different. So I was wondering whether if you were to do it again, like would you cast it in that framework?
Probably.
Like,
yeah, and I probably use words like this.
Great example.
Of niche conservatism, you're right. Right.
So one more question, if you don't mind.
No, sure.
So you say like large body size leads to extinction is hypertonic.
Yeah.
But is that true for large body size herbivores as well?
Yeah, no, I don't know, and that's something that I would like someone to work on. Yes.
Interplay between the body size and the feeding.
Right.
So if you tested it in
Right.
large herbivores, you
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I was wondering about the hypocarnivores. So you said that it seemed like the small hypocarnivores also
Had a short duration.
declines because of specialization, but I would almost think of it as being less specialized. Because like, right, a hypocarnivore would have a really broad feeding repertoire.
Right. Yes, we had when we wrote the paper, this came up. Yeah. No, that's fine. No, that's fine. I should have learned from that I need to make that more clear. Yeah, no, the reason, you have to think of it from a sort of morphological specialization. So those hypocarnivores, they haven't lost, well, they have lost some things in the front of their mouth, but they've also really specialized their rear molars. So they've gone morphologically in a direction that may be hard to back out of. Whereas the species that are in the middle, like the coyotes and the foxes, it's like, oh, you know, I could become more carnivorous and do this, or I could go more omnivorous and do that. So it's just being at those extremes. And perhaps because the hypocarnivores are more dependent on particular fruits, vegetation, plants, they might be more sensitive also to environmental change. But yeah, we still don't know. And there's not as many of them as the hypercarnivores, so the pattern isn't as obvious.
It definitely does look like a rapid in both directions.
Yeah.
Have you figured out like the event horizon?
The event?
Or whatever, I guess.
Why it happened? Why at the time? Yeah, no.
Right, like,
no, I haven't. Yeah, you got it. We got it. Okay, one more. I know.
So, is there any analogous situation going on with ectotherms as opposed to ectotherms? So you see it either in fishes or in terrestrial.
No one has done this. For fishes, there's body size a little bit. What was her name that gave the talk about it? Like in the Paleozoic, when she was looking at that transition, there was some, but it wasn't really a ratchet. But she did show that mostly the large ones went out. Yeah, dinosaurs, but then you get into a debate of so I think there has been a little work on dinosaurs, and I know somebody who was going to do it on dinosaurs, but I don't think he ever finished it. So yeah, but no, I don't. Yes, I am thinking of Lawrence. Yeah, right. All right, now for something slightly different, completely different. Okay, fractured teeth. And I know I've talked about this before to some of you, but a lot of you are new, so you don't know. So when I was a graduate student, I spent a lot of time in the Smithsonian looking at skulls and measuring them. As you see, of large carnivores, I observed a lot of individuals with teeth that were clearly broken in life. They'd broken them, they'd been worn, then part of the root was gone. And I go, ow, and like up there, we have some. And this is spotted hyena. So that's a spotted hyena with a nice complete set of teeth, and this is an older spotted hyena with some damaged teeth. And I found this rather surprising because teeth cannot repair themselves. Unlike your bones, which can heal, teeth don't. And you only get 2 sets, right? As a mammal, you get that initial set, but pretty much you just get this one adult set. So you would think that teeth would be designed, or natural selection would have made the teeth sufficiently strong for the expected forces that they would have to sustain. So I thought, well, that's interesting. I want to quantify this. So I went and counted up broken teeth many years ago in large carnivores, because I wondered if maybe some species like spotted hyenas that eat bones would break their teeth more or less frequently. They do have strengthened microstructure of their teeth that strengthens them actually, but nevertheless they break them. And I did this ultimately for something like 40-some species, 36 species, I lie. Yeah. And ranging in size from skunks all the way up to lions. And this is the percent of teeth that are broken. So this is counting all the teeth, not on a per individual basis, but all the teeth that in all the individuals that I looked at, what percent in each species had, what percent of them were broken. And it ranges from about less than 1% to 5%. And up here, what you see are the hyenas and the wolves and sea otters, animals that are eating relatively hard foods, and then things like cheetahs, which are the similar size to these animals but tend to avoid bone, are down here, and animals that aren't all that carnivorous are also over to the left. And so to make a long story short, what I found based on the extant sample was that meat eaters tended to break their teeth more often. Both their canine teeth were very frequently broken, and their cheek teeth, though, also more frequently than either omnivores or insect eaters. And the broken teeth were most common among species that tended to eat more bones or hard shells. So that made me think that, yes, bone consumption might be critical here, and this might be a key indicator in the fossil record of a bone eater if you didn't also have other clues about it. But I wanted to test this a little more, so I went on a campaign to collect a bunch of data on modern gray wolves, which there are many, many skulls of these poor animals in many museums. And this is what you see here is the percent broken teeth for a whole variety of populations, ranging from Isle Royale National Park. This is a population in Minnesota, Michigan, Alaska, New Mexico, Texas, Idaho, Canada, Sweden, and probably a little Norway, and Yellowstone National Park. So down here, these are the wolves that were reintroduced into Yellowstone in 1996. And I only have a sample of about 30 of these. But in these two cases, in both these examples, I knew that the ratio of prey to predator was very high. There was plenty of food for these animals, and they show relatively low fracture frequencies. In the case of Isle Royale, I also knew that that was an island that had only one prey item, basically, for the wolves, the moose, and that they also were relatively limited. So this was strongly suggestive that bone consumption could be an indicator of how much, that tooth fracture could be an indicator of bone consumption, and therefore how heavily these animals were utilizing carcasses, how much they were finishing. And this suggests, yes, that tooth wear and fracture frequency could be indicative of the quantity of bone in the diet, and consequently that could give you an index or some sort of indicator of levels of food stress in these large carnivores, and therefore it might say something about the relative abundance of predator and prey. So this might be a way to go back into the fossil record and actually get an idea about relative abundance, which is one of the hardest things to do with the fossil record because there's so many biases in what ends up being preserved. All right, so simple, very simple. Ecologists don't kill me for this. Many predators plus few prey is going to, like many predators, few prey, I should find lots of broken teeth. The opposite, few predators and many prey, then I'm going to find relatively few broken teeth. That was the hypothesis. Now, where would I go to test this? I need big sample sizes because tooth fracture, even though is a still rare, relatively speaking, a rare occurrence. So I need large samples of teeth. So I found 4 late Pleistocene localities, of course the first of which was Rancho La Brea, ranging in age from 45,000 to 12,000 years ago, and I sampled these 5 species, the saber-tooth, the giant lion, the dire wolf, the coyote, and the mountain lion. At least I did that at the tar pits and wherever they were all present. Those were the 5 that I did. So I ended up with over 4,500 teeth and over 1,000 individuals. And I found this surprising result, which I didn't know what to make of at first. So here's my extant large species, starting sort of with the cheetah in gray, and here are those Pleistocene species. So some of them have enormous fracture rates. This is the percent of all their teeth that are broken. But the Pleistocenes in general are high, And what's nice about working, oh yeah, and this one is data from a different paper somebody else did on this saber-toothed cat from Texas, which was found in a cave with a lot of juvenile mammoth bones that they apparently brought back. And the kittens of the Homotheria, it was a den site, and bones showed gnaw marks and all kinds of things like that. What's nice about dealing in the recent past, like the Pleistocene, is you can actually compare the same species then and now. So there's the coyote from Rancho La Brea versus coyote today. And there's the wolf from Beringia versus gray wolf from all my samples that I took across North America. So you have this higher fracture frequency in the past, it seems. So this, I argued at the time, suggested that interspecific competition for kills was more intense in the Pleistocene than we typically see today in large carnivore communities, that led to greater carcass utilization on average over their lifetimes, and therefore more heavily worn and broken teeth, which was nice, but it would be better if I had a better assessment of the relationship between carcass utilization and tooth fracture. So the inference of my association here between higher tooth fracture frequency and levels of prey availability is complicated by a couple of things. One, I already mentioned, this is a small sample size. This is also a small sample size at this time. It's less than 30, and that was about 30 wolves. The second is that the problem with tooth fracture is you're more likely to have broken a tooth the older you are, right? We all know that. The longer you live, the more likely. So I had to somehow control for age. And I can't do that. In most cases, you know, with a museum specimen, you do not know the age of death of that individual. So I did not have that information. Now I can infer age from tooth wear, but this gets a little bit circular because if they're eating bone, they're wearing their teeth more quickly and so on. So that's not ideal either. So what I really need is a population somewhere where I have known aged individuals, and if even better, I have data on carcass utilization. So where would I possibly find something like that? And especially if they had started off with one predator-prey ratio and then subsequently changed to another. Lucky me, great, lucky all of us. Probably the greatest ecological experiment in history, it has been called that, the reintroduction of the gray wolf into Yellowstone in 1995 and 96. When they were reintroduced, there were over elk present, and the park showed serious signs of overgrazing. That was part of the rationale, of course, for bringing them back in. So we're bringing a predator into a prey system, which has a very skewed predator-prey ratio, or prey-to-predator ratio. The Yellowstone Wolf Project started that very day, I guess, or before, and they have monitored these populations very closely. And here you see from 1997 to this is 2012, the elk starting off very high. This is the elk, no, that's the wolf pattern over here is elk in thousands. The elk declined over the last 20 years as expected. The wolves went up and then fluctuated and then have settled down about here. So we do see, as expected, the decline in the elk, but we do see at the beginning a very high prey-to-predator ratio, and we can just plot it that way, which makes it easier to see. So this is the number of elk per wolf in early Yellowstone versus later Yellowstone. This is derived from those two graphs I just showed you. So you see how it comes down to about 2006, and then it's sort of staying about the same. These are years they didn't have good data on the numbers of elk. So I can divide my data set, if I have wolf skulls, over this entire period, which I do. I divided it by 10-year segments. So we have early Yellowstone and late Yellowstone, and then you'll see those coming up in the next slide. Over the past 25 years, it's expected that elk have become harder to catch and kill. First of all, there are fewer of them. Second, we know from all the behavioral studies, they're more vigilant. They're moving away from areas where they think they might get caught. They're better at avoiding wolves, and yes, they're more vigilant and aware of the wolves. So we'd expect over time to see initially very little carcass utilization and unworn teeth and few fractured teeth, and then more fractured teeth when we get into this zone here. And, oh yeah, one of the nice things about tooth fracture is you would think, I mean, despite the fact that these wolves are really well studied, they don't have data on whether it really is harder for the wolves to capture them. They don't have that kind of data to say, well, it used to take them 3 hours or 2 days to find an elk. Now it takes them 4 days. It's very difficult to get that kind of data. So tooth fracture could give us an insight into what's going on that you can't get from behavior. I also looked at these two populations more closely. So Isle Royale National Park now has been studied for over 6 years. This is this island out in the middle of Lake Superior that has basically just a wolf-moose ecosystem. And then this is Scandinavia, so it's mostly Sweden, but a little Norway, so we'll call it Southern Scandinavia. I sampled wolves from there that have been caught from 1998 or died between 1998 and 2010. So Swedish wolves came into this part of Sweden relatively recently, like I think it was in the early 90s. This gave me this kind of a sampling scheme. So I have 4 different samples here, or populations if we want to call them that. That's the number of skulls. In Yellowstone, the primary prey is elk. Over 90% of their prey are elk. In Isle Royale in Scandinavia, it's moose. So that's nice, I've got parallels there. Here's the prey to predator ratios. So I've got 2 populations that have very high prey to predator ratios and 2 that have lower ones. And for Isle Royale in Scandinavia, there were studies done on carcass utilization. So in Isle Royale, this was based on counting up all the entire kill, how many bones were taken, how much of it was gone, counting hide, counting all the bones, counting all the flesh, and so a lot of it. They eat 90% of what they kill, they eat. In Sweden, this is 70%. That doesn't look like a big difference, but the way that was done, they didn't count bones at all. They were just looking at edible biomass, so just the muscle, basically, and some of the organs. So they ate much less than that, right? All right, so my expected tooth fracture frequencies then are in early Yellowstone low, later Yellowstone high, Isle Royale high because of this predator-prey ratio, and in Scandinavia more like early Yellowstone. So what I did is, so I collected data on dental wear stage. These are 3 Yellowstone wolves, slight wear, moderate wear, and heavy wear. I count the number of broken teeth, it's very low tech here. Identify which teeth they are. Because what we're really interested in seeing is whether these cheek teeth are being heavily used. Canine teeth get broken for a variety of reasons, which complicates the story a bit, but because they're used for killing and aggression. So it's really, the focus should be on these teeth. And the wonderful thing was that in Yellowstone National Park in Isle Royale, I had age of death for these specimens. Because these guys have been collecting, these people have been working so hard on collecting all these data. So looking at the top, so in this case, I've given you percent of individuals. So this is the percent of skulls that had at least 1 broken tooth. So here are my 2 populations that had the high prey to predator ratio, and there's the 2 that have the opposite. So quite a significant difference. But I usually do this at the tooth level rather than the individual level, because when you go on the fossil record, you can't get whole skulls, so you have to just deal with teeth. So we'll focus on these results, and you get the same basic result. And what I've done here is remove the canine teeth so that you can see that it's not simply a matter of canine teeth being broken. It is also the cheek teeth, which we will see in the next slide. So in this one, we're looking at tooth fracture frequency by tooth position. So going from front to back, incisors, premolars, carnassials. I left something out. Incisors, canines, premolars, carnassials, and postcarnassial molars. And what you can see is that in these 2, where we have the more higher tooth fracture frequencies, it is not simply the canines, which I showed you before, but also you see that there is very big increase. We'll look at Yellowstone early versus Yellowstone later, especially in the carnassial fracture, and actually not so much in the canine as you might expect. And same here, just massive amount of fracture. So these are the teeth that we expect to be used for processing bone, to break up bones, crack bones. All right. Yeah, so what about wear? Because I have this problem. So they are coincident, and it does show a similar pattern. So in this graph, what you're seeing, again, the 2 populations with lots of prey and few predators on the left, and the ones the opposite on the right. you can see this is the percent of individuals in my sample that were classified as slight wear, as moderate wear, as heavy wear. So Scandinavia and early Yellowstone are characterized by a lot of slightly worn individuals. Interestingly, poor Isle Royale, even if everybody wears their teeth very frequently, but you can see the shift here between Yellowstone early and Yellowstone late, that we're getting more individuals with heavy wear. Brings us to the question about age. Is this just that these two populations, for whatever reason, happen to have individuals that lived longer and therefore have more broken teeth? So I had to control for age, and now we have to leave Scandinavia out because I don't have data on that. But how in this graph, what you're looking at, age is the number of individuals in each age class. So we're testing to see whether there is a bias toward older individuals in Yellowstone late and Isle Royale. And there is a slight bias in that direction, as you can see. This is very dominated by young age 1 to 3 individuals. These have more middle-aged, and this one more 7 and plus. So I got a control for that. So let's take each of those age categories and look at tooth fracture rate. So this is the percent in each wear stage in Yellowstone early, Yellowstone late, and Isle Royale. And wait a minute. I knew I was going to get confused. I do want this one in here, but yeah. Oh yeah, so in this case, we're looking at age 7 plus. Oh yeah, here they are. Here's the ages. Yeah, so this is all the older individuals. This is the 4 to 6-year-old individuals, and this is the 1 to 3-year-old individuals. So what you can see is that in this case, we have a lot more heavy wear with the older age, which is what we expect. Now we want to look at the tooth fracture rate in there, and that's what I thought I was going to get. Oh no, why am I confused? Hold on, I am confused, sorry. Oh, I can't have tooth fracture in there. That's right. It's the first time I've given this slide. Sorry. And I keep changing the way I present this in my paper. Okay, so what this is showing is that we do have, that not only are the Yellowstone late and Isle Royale have more broken teeth, but they also they're wearing their teeth more rapidly. So in this case, we have slight individuals persisting all the way up into the 7+ year category. In this case, we do not. And we see that they're moving from the slight wear category into the moderate categories and the heavy wear categories more rapidly at the same time as they're fracturing their teeth. And in Isle Royale, these poor things, there are no 1 to 3-year-olds with slight wear and they never appear, of course, and things move very rapidly into the heavy wear category. So in both the late Yellowstone and Isle Royale, the individuals are wearing their teeth more rapidly as they age, and they are breaking their teeth more often as they age. So all of this is consistent with increased carcass utilization. So in Isle Royale, we have this very heavy carcass utilization. Scandinavia, much less so, and we see this difference in tooth fracture rate. For Yellowstone, there is data on carcass utilization, but they again did it in a slightly different way, and I had to sort of collate it. So they would go out as often as they could when they saw wolves kill something. They would wait for the wolves to leave the kill, and then they would hike, snowshoe, whatever, to the kill, and they record what bones were present, what bones were missing, and a variety of other data. Things about whether there were footprints of other carnivores around and all kinds of things like that. But so what we have is the percent of the skeleton, basically, that was left behind or that was removed, whichever way you want to look at it. And when you graph that over time, and this is a fraction of the skeleton that was removed from 2,300 wolf kills over this time period, 1996 to 2016, I've just plotted it. Just pay attention to the all bones line at the moment. That's just the entire skeleton and the percentage that was left. This data are not amenable to regression because there's a lot of heteroscedasticity here. So I just plotted a moving average here, and there is a trend, it appears, in that they are removing more of the skeleton in the second decade than they did on average in the first decade. The amount they take, and a lot of this is winter kill data, or is data taking during the winter, which is affected, the amount wolves will kill, the number of elk they can kill is affected by snowfall. So there's a lot of weather influence on these data. So when there's lots of snow, it's easier to kill elk, and they will not probably finish a carcass as completely as other times. So that's probably part of the scatter. I plot that's a moving average that the Oh, the big dots. That's the fraction of the elk skeleton removed. So from this case, it was less than 20% of their skeleton was removed. At this point, it's closer to 40% removed of the skeleton removed. So for example, for the humerus here, this is how many humeri were present in a single year. They might have gone to see 100 kills, and how many humeri, or it's the percentage of the humeri that were remaining. There should be 2 humeri for every kill, right? So this is the fraction that remained. Right? And the interesting thing is the humerus follows this quite closely because they tended to remove the forelimb rather than the hind limb, because the forelimb is only attached by muscle to the rib cage, whereas with a hip, it's a much more difficult operation for any carnivore to do. So they take the entire forelimb. If I did the radius and the ulna, they'd all follow that same line. It was gone. Right? So it's kind of nice. Right. So I think all these data together strongly suggest that you can use tooth fracture analysis as some sort of index of relative carcass utilization. Yeah, so I'll summarize. Let's see if we got it all right here. So, in the sample wolves, a rise in tooth fracture frequency is associated with decline in the availability of their primary prey, as estimated by the ratio of prey to predator abundance. That this increase in wear and fracture is greatest among the teeth most likely to be involved in processing bones, so the cheek teeth. That quantitative data on wolf kills from Scandinavia, Isle Royale, and Yellowstone suggests that higher rates of tooth fracture are associated with more bone consumption. And these results, not only what's important to me, these results support the use of tooth fracture frequency as a proxy for relative in modern and ancient ecosystems. And why should we care about? Yeah, so back to this. What is this telling us about those ancient ecosystems of the Pleistocene, not so ancient, and why would we want to care? So it implies that the competition for kills was more intense on average than in modern ecosystems, and that these abundant, diverse, large predators likely exerted significant top-down effects within ecosystems, which is something we have not really been able to study in modern ecosystems, because we extirpated most of the large carnivores over a large part of the planet before we even started studying ecology in its modern sense. So they've been somewhat ignored because they can't do it. Yeah, and it also suggests, yes, that modern ecosystems in which predators are at low density may be very different from what was typical in the past. And I want to show you how much more diverse these things were. So in this plot, these are 3 modern communities: Yellowstone, this is a park in India, Royal Chitwan, and Etosha in South Africa. The black bar indicates the total number of species of hypercarnivores. And then the dark blue here, this is subdivided into hypercarnivores that are much larger than 100 kilos versus those that are less than 100 kilos. So we don't have any like that in Yellowstone anymore. In Royal Chitwan, there's a tiger, so there's one. In Etosha, there's a lion, so there's one. This is the Pleistocene. This is the Pleistocene in the New World. This is actually Rancho La Brea. Look at the number of large carnivorous, over 100 kilo animals coexisting for thousands of years. We're not talking about a temporary thing. This went on for 1 million years, 2 million years, coexisting. So we have something like 3 of them here. We have, same in the old world, much, much greater diversity. And these things, they weren't smaller. We weren't packing more smaller ones in. They were big, and they were saber-toothed, like this, like this. That's how big the short-faced bear was, the one at the tar pits. And even the hyena was about 30, in the old world, was about 30 or 50% larger than spotted hyenas in Africa today. These are very scary, big creatures. And what's interesting is who else evolved? Who evolved at this time around all these creatures? We did. We did. This must have influenced our evolution. Of course, I think it's responsible for everything that's intelligent about us, right? It's all about the carnivores, but maybe a few other things. But yeah, but it must have influenced our drive to be social, our drive to figure out how to hunt, for example. Yes, quite important. Yeah, so, and also what's interesting is that another implication of this work, so these are all some of the large herbivores that supported some of these large carnivores, large herbivores on the side. And these sorts of communities, as I said, were stable this is North America, stable for hundreds of thousands, millions of, a couple of million years. In the last million years, they were invaded by new carnivores like the lion, like not the running bear, but the grizzly bear, the wolf. All of those came from the old world into the new world during this time period. And this community was not destabilized. We don't see a blip or anything with this additional carnivore that comes in. But when do we see a blip? When this one comes in. We see a major blip. And now I'm not sure how far back we think this is now. I usually would say 12,000 years, a few years ago, but now I think it's more, the dates are getting pushed back, so it's 20,000 years or whatever. So it wasn't maybe a blitzkrieg where they came and they wiped everything out quickly, but they were very effective. And it may have been that their ability to be effective was in part because there were so many large carnivores. It was already a top-down force community with the prey being limited by these large carnivores that allowed this extremely flexible predator, omnivorous hunter of large prey to be so successful at altering the ecosystem. So yes, perhaps because prey numbers were already limited by the native predators, this resulted in herbivore populations under top-down control and that were vulnerable to the addition of an unusually flexible predator, being a human, right? Yeah, so, and this all came from tooth fracture. And I had no idea when I started the tooth fracture study. As I said, I started it purely on a biomechanical sort of natural history perspective. I had no idea that it was going to lead to insights into Pleistocene ecosystems or maybe a new way of assessing in wolf populations how food stressed they are or something like that. I had no idea. And I just think it's a great example of serendipity that in science, and that you just never know what great thing you might discover that interests people, even when you're doing something that seems rather trivial. So, and I'll end there and take questions. Thanks. And I'll take some water. Yeah. Victoria. Oh, I forgot this one. That's important.
Humans have been around for much longer. And there's a higher diversity. Mm-hmm. So the story's more complex. What am I missing? Why, there's lots of humans there, and there's lots of diversity of large.
Yes. Yeah, it happened earlier. So in Africa, there was an even greater diversity of large carnivores. And there seems to have been an extinction. Like the saber-tooths were gone about 1 million years ago in Africa, whereas they hung on until 50,000 years ago in the old world, and here until 10,000, 11,000, 12,000 years ago. So the people had already had the impact in Africa. That's a partial answer. The problem is the fossil record is in Africa of that time period is not all that good, so we can't really track the extinction, but there are people working on that. And that is the suggestion, is that it happened actually earlier. They'd already lost. I mean, there used to be something like at least 5 species of elephants in Africa for much of the Pleistocene. So how did that work? I mean, yeah, I mean that's and they were gone pretty, at least 1 million years ago.
So Ryan and then Rachel.
So Blaire.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Ryan.
These carnivores peanut brittle because I guess the question is that it sort of occurred to me that
they chew ice. They chew their ice from their drinks.
There could be a positive feedback loop where when prey items are limited, you have sort of developmental, maybe structural differences in genes like malnutrition or
right.
Where
Okay.
the teeth may just be more likely to break. Any evidence of that? Is there no like the structures of like early and late Yellowstone wolves?
No, and I doubt that would happen. But interestingly, Isle Royale. So Isle Royale, the wolves are seriously inbred. So that it was a consideration, and they have skeletal pathologies that are apparently a consequence of this inbreeding, and a lot of backbone problems and things. So
doesn't show up when.
But you don't see it, and the thing is that all the Swedish or the Scandinavian wolves are highly inbred as well. They have some of the skeletal pathologies. They're taking moose. They don't break their teeth all the time. So it doesn't seem likely that inbreeding is resulting in weak teeth. I mean, the teeth, yeah, or malnourishment, because the teeth are going to be, well, the juvenile teeth are going to be formed before the carnivores are born, I mean, in utero. But I doubt that's the case, but it might be worth looking at, yeah. Oh, he's in charge.
My question is just curiosity. How do you tell apart what is damaged while the animal's alive and then when it's...
Yeah, I didn't. So you can tell because I would only count them as broken in life if they had no sharp edges whatsoever. It was worn. They showed heavy wear. And you could also, sometimes you might think, oh, well, if there's only one tooth, maybe it's just an old individual, it's just worn down, it didn't break. But if you have a complete skull, it was harder with fossils, you usually have both sides. So you can look at one side is unworn and this side has a broken tooth, right. So you do things like that. But it's always an underestimate. If I wasn't sure, I didn't count it.
Yes, I'm wondering, so this is fascinating to me for a lot of different reasons. On one hand, you have sort of like digital specialization in these lineages that are specializing on like bone crunching versus,
right.
Versus meat specialists versus carnivores. And it seems to me that you have these sort of dual pressures, right? One, like on the tooth to be able to specialize for the diet, but also potential resistance of the forces that are required,
right?
In order to prevent cracking, right?
Right. Yes.
I was wondering if, has anyone actually looked at the resistance to cracking?
Yes.
And does that change as well?
Yeah, like in the evolution of hyenas, and then also the evolution of hyena-like dogs that are now extinct, as Guy Jack Sang, who did for part of his dissertation, he looked at the microstructure, the dental microstructure, and it's amazing. The dental microstructure is in the enamel. So your enamel has these crisscross prisms, and in hyenas, you can strengthen the enamel by making more and more crisscrosses, and it's kind of like plywood, but going back and zigzagging back and forth at a microscopic level, and those act as crack stoppers. And in hyenas, the zigzagging is in 3 dimensions. It's just incredible. I can't really picture it in my head, but you can make a model. And you see it evolve in sequential cheek teeth over time in both the bone-eating dogs and the hyenas. And there's some other animals. I think wolverines also show it. So there are adaptations within the microscopic adaptations at the level of the enamel that strengthen teeth to prevent cracking. But they must be somewhat costly because not that many animals do it. I mean, from a developmental standpoint, it must be somewhat costly. Yeah. Does that answer? Yeah.
How are the size of the prey influence?
Yeah.
So mammoth bones
right.
would be harder than these?
Right. So that in one of the papers, the 2009 paper, I looked for a correlation between relative prey size and tooth fracture, and I did not see it. It's all over the place. And I think partly it is because it's not that they take the whole mammoth bone, like in a cartoon, and stick it in their mouth. They're always going to go towards the ends, the articular ends, and then they're going to gnaw their way. And the bone is softer there. There's spongy bones, so they always start that way. I don't think they take the shaft and yeah, it's a cartoon influence. I know. Yeah, right. Yeah.
So a couple of methodological questions and then one sort of other one. But so can you not look at cementum annuli in extinct?
Well,
because we do that for aging, and you could do it like in the Yellowstone one.
Oh yeah, well they have known ages. So the Yellowstone ones I had known ages, but usually museums don't want you to. You have to section.
Pull their teeth in.
No, no, and we
so
tried.
In theory, maybe. But
well, for the tar pits, one of my graduate students, Wendy Binder, we did look at. The interesting thing about tar pits was that with the dire wolves, we could look at tooth fracture through time because different tar pits are from different time periods, and so there were time periods where there was heavy fracture, a lot of fracture, and there were other time periods where there was less. And so I say, well, is it because they got a bunch of old wolves in this pit and young wolves in that pit? And what we did is, or she did, she x-rayed their jaws, and when the teeth, canines first erupt, the pulp cavity is really large, and then the dentin fills in this way and closes it. So you can get relative age, but the problem is with that takes about 4 years. So you can't, so you can see really young ones, and then you can see that they're now adult, but you can't get 10 on the, yeah. But that was interesting because there wasn't an age difference between the two pits as far as we could tell. So.
And with the fracture, I just wanted, so you said everything, it's all like how many teeth are broken?
Yeah.
So you're either broken or you're not? Like, is there no sort of
I didn't try anything like half broken. No, just broken. But mostly, I wouldn't take just a chip. A chip I wouldn't count. Yeah, had to be substantial.
And the last one is just that, is there evidence when there's lower availability of some of these carnivores being broader in their diet? And how might that?
People have done isotopic studies on like the tar pits, and they don't seem to be any different from, and same with the wolves from Bringy. Not that we know of, but that would be happening probably on a time scale that we wouldn't be able to, because everything is time averaged here, yeah. Which is the other interesting thing about why I think it's significant, because it's something like tooth fracture rate. If you look over a narrow window, you might see a high fracture rate, as I'm doing with the Isle Royal wolves. But when you're looking at in the fossil record, the longer time span you look over, you'd expect to see a lower rate, because it might be high and low and high and low, but you're going to average it out, and it's going to be low. It's just like rates of evolution, right? Yeah, rates of evolution look faster over short time spans than long time spans, because they're not constant. So the fact that there are still these high rates in these Pleistocene samples that are time averaged over hundreds of years or whatever implies to me that they were really quite high rates, yeah, a lot of the time. Yeah.
Well, I guess we've learned that you shouldn't always eat everything on your plate. And let's thank Blaire for more time.